Good morning. I'm Fred Bergston, now Director Emeritus of the Peterson Institute and a full-time senior fellow here, standing in for Adam Posen, who will be joining us in an hour or so. We're delighted this morning and for the next few hours to be releasing with our close colleagues from China 2 reports on one of the world's major economic initiatives. China's One Belt, One Road, or Belt and Road Initiative, a project which envisages several $1 trillion of investment in infrastructure in more than 60 countries, spanning all of Asia and ranging into Europe. Breathtaking is an adjective often used to describe the idea, which is indeed vast and far-reaching. And we felt that it was therefore an opportune topic, indeed a necessary topic, to try to analyze in some depth, draw implications for the region, the world, the two countries, China and the United States as well, and to try to get a handle on what the likely developments are, what the issues are, what problems will be raised, and what impact the whole idea could have, not just on the region in Asia itself, but indeed ranging beyond that to the world economy as a whole. Huge questions are raised of finance, of development strategy, of governance, of trade policy, and so it's a very fertile field for research and analysis. In pursuing that, we were particularly delighted to be able to partner with our colleagues at the China Development Research Foundation. The Peterson Institute and the Foundation did a joint project a year ago on the bilateral investment treaty that the two countries are pursuing. We agreed then to take on this project with a series of papers from both the Institute and from the Foundation, and we will be releasing those here in Washington today. We actually had a release meeting on them in Beijing a month ago. We'll be releasing them in New York tomorrow. And so this is part of a roadshow in which we try to convey the fruits of our research to a variety of audiences on this huge and very important project. Without further ado, I want to introduce Lu Mai, who is the Director General, the Secretary General of the China Development Research Foundation, a longtime leader in international economic and other research activities in China, one of the founders of the famous China Development Forum, and a true leader and one of the most influential persons in China, trying to bring new ideas, solid research, analytical thinking into the policy process. He's with us here today. I want to introduce Mr. Lu Mai to give some introductory remarks on our conference. Mr. Lu.
Thank you, Fred. And good morning. I saw some of my good friends here, and so we're very glad to present this report with Peterson Institute. This is the second project that we run, as just Fred said. Peterson and the China Development Forum, Research Foundation, doing the first one is a bilateral investment treaty. I hope it makes some progress in the practice, but I don't know the result yet. And this is the second one, and we both, I think, just like Fred said, it's an important initiative made by Chinese government. And the Belt and the Road Initiative, which itself is not about bilateral relations, but it's important for both sides. So the U.S. is not covered by the Belt and the Road Initiative. Former U.S. Secretary Hillary Clinton rolled out the New Silk Road Initiative years ago. So the U.S. is definitely interested in the vision. And the two countries are now seeking better mutual understanding and a new area of cooperation while trying to avoid misunderstanding and confrontation. So research on this topic, the Peterson Institute and the CDRF has been expanding the scope of cooperation and the mutual understanding. I hope we achieve this goal. The primary result are for all to see. We see this good quality. I just learned that from Fred, and he also see from Chinese side the quality of paper is good. And when we launch this in China, it's covered by the Weibo, Weixin, and the newspaper, so including the several US-sized paper. So it's good for both sides to have this very fruitful result, fruitful work. It also process for CDRF is a capacity building. So Peterson Institute has a long history, and compared with CDRF, we established ourselves 1998. So relatively short history. So it's good for both sides. That's the first point I want to mention. Second point I want to mention, that's the content of the research report. You can see from Chinese paper, 7 of that, it's informative and inspiring. That's what I heard, the comment. Chinese researcher, including colleague of CDRF and from other distinguished guests, scholar in this program, give the detail and the background and the progress of this Belt and the Road Initiative. So I hope it's useful to understand from Chinese side, and the development is made. From Peterson side, it's also very helpful. It goes the detail about different region, different country. It gave very good suggestions, comments on China's initiative, including the lessons like the Tanzan railway, and some other suggestions on the governance, the structure, and how to deal with the turmoil, the unstable political environment, and so on. So I think this is good for both sides to understand, and those suggestions, comments, very useful. The third, I see the differences. Both sides interpret the Belt and the Road Initiative, but a little bit of difference. If we see the subtitle in the Peterson one, they call the China Belt and the Road Initiative, Motive, Scope, and the Challenges. From a Chinese side, they also said the Belt and the Road Initiative, promoting just and inclusive new international orders. So it's interesting to see from a different perspective to look at it. If we look at this issue, usually we, especially my friends in the Peterson, look at China specifically about the government, what they want, why they do this. But I hope they also see from another side, from a demand side. I attend a conference held by International Food Institute in Ethiopia. The premier of Ethiopia come and say, I have a goal. By 2022, we will become the middle income country. So we will grow from a low-income country to middle-income country. And then he mentioned the infrastructure and the development industry and so on. And I heard that also Sri Lanka Premier also mentioned their plan to get rid of a low-income status and grows up to the middle-income country. That's from the demand side. And China believes if you want to go from a low-income country to the middle-income country, infrastructure is very important. And also, that's we learned from World Bank. From 1980s, they gave us suggestion. So what about China's infrastructure? Can we provide something to the other country? I would like to show you this. This is in Guizhou, the expressway network. So it's already connected to each county city. So 县通公路 highway. And this is a high-speed railway under construction. And in Guizhou, government spent a lot of money to help them to get rid of poverty. This is if counted by the per capita GDP, is lowest one in China. But now they are under the construction of our infrastructure. You see, the total length is 857 kilometers, and the cost for each kilometer is 100 million RMB. So, but with the central government efforts, it goes quite well. Is there another one? Yes, the bridge. We see a lot of tunnel, we see a lot of bridge, and this bridge is across from Bohai, from Qingdao to Huangdao to another in Shandong province. So it's really there are several these kind of the long bridge. So China learned from abroad, get help from international society, multinational company, and we built up our capacity and to meet this demand. 要致富先修路. If you want to be prosperity, you should build up the road. That's China learned, and China can share those with the other country, especially in those Belt and Road country. Well, many of those countries is in the lower or middle income. Total GDP per capita is just half of average of the world. So it needs a lot of this kind of the work. I think just as they said, the ancient Silk Road witnessed the exchange between the countries. Its decline followed the great divergence. That's happened in the history. Now, are we in another trend? So someone said we are in the convergence. And we saw that from many countries, just like China, India, try to catch up. If we look at the Human Development Index, it's more easier to see these trends. And just as Professor Amartya Sen pointed out, the life expectancy now is tried to be close, especially low-income countries try to catch up. And if we look at education, it's also the trend. So from a Human Development Index to the GDP per capita, I hope we can see this convergence, and we can see only 1.5 billion people now is in the high-income country, development country, but now 4.0 billion people including China, India, Brazil, and some others, try to join. So in this background, we are working, we are building our community of a common future. So One Belt, One Road, if we look in this size, the demand size, but also the historical trend, I think it will be easier to understand. Now, China really learned from experience of many developed countries already did. For example, we know that in Africa, the Tanzania railway is a bad case. But now we also see some successful case. In the Peterson Institute, they mentioned some project. But like in Myanmar, we saw some successful project. And the company, both Chinese and the local, working on the basis of a social responsibility, the corporate social responsibility, and get the support from local residents, and they hire the local worker and treat the local engineer. All those is learned from our experience, from international good practice. So China always be seen as a good student. So some question raised in those report, I think it will be very careful, read, and also it's already made some progress. So let's work together to help this project to be successful. And also, I hope this is not the area for compete U.S. and China. It's an area we can work together. For example, how to keep this project with the environment protection, with the local benefit, and so on. So it will help in this area for the local people to find a job, to get rid of poverty, and stabilize the situation. That's also need by U.S. and China to counter terrorism. So I think if both sides understand each other better, we can find a more mutual interest area. I hope from this seminar, we build up this mutual understanding. That's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Liu. You've already gotten us off to a very good start in discussing the topic of the day. We've organized the rest of the conference into three parts. The first panel, which will start immediately, will do an overview and an analysis of some of the economic implications of the initiative. We'll then have a luncheon discussion where Adam Posen and Mr. Liu will have a bit of an interchange, and you all get a chance for some questions to Mr. Liu about what he has just said and what he says then. And then we'll have a final panel in the afternoon that will talk about implications for the future, policy ideas, and how to pursue the cooperation that Mr. Liu has just talked about. The first panel, then, will be an overview with primarily an analysis of the economic implications of the One Belt, One Road initiative for the region, for the world, and what it implies for the individual key countries involved. We have three speakers. The first, who was the co-editor of the Institute's publication that we're releasing today, is Simeon Djankov. Simeon has been a visiting fellow here at the Institute now for 3 years. And in that context, he has written a couple of books for us, one on the Euro crisis, an eyewitness account, which he was deeply involved in, another one on the Great Rebirth, the lessons from the victory of capitalism over communism in Eastern Europe. Simeon, prior to joining us at the Institute, was Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance in Bulgaria from 2009 to 2013. It's directly relevant since Bulgaria may well be a participant in the One Belt, One Road. But in that capacity, of course, Simeon was deeply involved in the response to the Euro crisis and brings firsthand experience with that issue. During that time, among other things, he was the chairman of the board of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, which again, of course, has direct relevance for the kinds of issues we're talking about here. Before Simeon returned to Bulgaria to become minister, he spent 14 years at the World Bank, where he was chief economist of the finance and private sector vice presidency, among other things, developing the World Bank's Doing Business project. So from many different angles, Simeon is deeply experienced on this issue. At the current time, he's also rector of the New Economic School in Russia. He's a visiting lecturer at Harvard's Kennedy School. He did his PhD in economics at the University of Michigan, which will make Ken Lieberthal happy since he's a fellow Michigan alumnus. So Simeon will lead off. We will then turn to two of our Chinese colleagues, Mr. Fang Jin, who is Deputy Secretary General of the China Development Research Foundation, working there with Mr. Liu Mai. Prior to that, he was a research fellow at the Development Research Center of the State Council in China. He's written extensively on China's foreign economic policy, globalization, the world economy. He did his doctorate at the School of Economics at Peking University after completing a master's at Macquarie University in Australia. And then our third panelist will be Mr. Huang Zhigang, also, of course, from China. He is the president of Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation in the Ministry of Commerce. He has spent a number of years in the ministry. He was deputy director of the Department of Foreign Trade in the Commerce Ministry, where he was deeply involved in China's entry to the WTO, engaged in those negotiations for a number of years, and also involved in their APEC participation. He worked for a while in the Economic Office of the State Council and did his PhD in economics at Nankai University's International Economic Trade Institute. Both Mr. Fan and Mr. Wu have contributed to the report that the China Development Research Foundation is releasing here today. You have copies of that. They will give us summaries of their papers and then be prepared to discuss this range of issues with the audience. So, start with Simeon Djankov, then to Mr. Fan, Mr. Wu, and each of them I think speak from here maybe. And then after you each speak, then we'll go up to the panel and answer questions from the audience. So, Simeon, to start it off.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you all for coming. I will make a few remarks to start this conversation, largely based on the booklet that we are putting out today. As was mentioned a month ago, we already presented some of these findings in China. To me, what's most perhaps useful for this in preparing this book and in the discussions that follow is just some fact-finding. Basically, trying to understand what this initiative is about. It's a relatively recent initiative with remarkably little public information on both on motivation, on scope, and on what it is supposed to cover in the future. I rarely say this, but in this particular case, knowing Russian helped a lot, since for some first, perhaps competition reasons, there was a lot more material in the Russian language that I was able to find in English on this topic. and it consisted of two distinct phases. Before 2014, before the West put some economic and financial sanctions on Russia, the tone of the Russian media was distinctly chilly on this topic. Basically, that this is not a good initiative, that it's an initiative that replicates a lot of other initiatives, particularly led by Russia. So for these reasons, Russia is not going to be an active participant. And after the financial sanctions of 2014, suddenly the tone changed and Russia became a very big admirer of this initiative, indeed proposing some additions to how it can develop. So in making my initial remarks, I would like to really structure them and present to you 3 points. The first point of what we understand about the motivation behind this initiative. So what is the One Belt, One Road about? The second point is what are some of the challenges that we see, at least from our perspective today. And the third I already mentioned, how is the viewpoint of one of the largest countries and largest economies in the region that is covered, that is Russia. How has it changed? I already mentioned how has it changed. And what Russia thinks of this initiative in terms of motivation, which you would notice is substantially different from what both the West thinks of this initiative and perhaps the initial motivation coming from China. So 3 points. First point on motivation. There is, of course, motivation that has been put forward in some of the documents that present this initiative in China and around the world. But from an economist perspective, we could get sufficient evidence to suggest that there are basically 3 main reasons, three motivations for starting this initiative. The first one can be called trade policy, trade basically inspired motivation, which is essentially to export construction services. So the logic goes approximately like this. Over the last couple of decades at least, China has been very successful in building up its infrastructure and having infrastructure investment-led growth account for a large part of its overall growth. That seems in more recent years to be slowing down, and hence an initiative to export some of this construction ability, both in terms of investment that can support it abroad, in terms of construction companies that are now apt at building particular large infrastructure projects, and also some of the know-how that comes along with building very, very large infrastructure projects. And indeed, if you look at some of the projects that we know about and where there is sufficient public information, there is some analysis that suggests that in about 3/4 of the projects that already have been completed or ongoing under the One Belt, One Road initiative, in the contract signed, there are explicit requirements for using Chinese companies, Chinese know-how, Chinese machinery, and Chinese, or at least in part, Chinese financing for doing the particular projects in all the 65 or so countries that are already part of this initiative. I should say that this area has to be researched a bit more, since some countries do put out publicly some of the documentations. Russia has been a surprise, to me at least, in that regard, of putting quite a lot of information on the projects that are already ongoing in Russia. Kazakhstan has put some evidence in the public domain, but from a number of other countries, we still don't know in terms of public procurement what exactly the projects entail. But the first motivation is essentially exporting construction services to the One Belt, One Road countries. The second motivation is basically to use this initiative and the financing that goes with it to basically make a push, support the Chinese currency in becoming a more global currency. And you can see this motivation expressly written sometimes in documents, but that's why I started my discussion with Russia, especially after 2014, the financial sanctions that were imposed on Russia. Suddenly, this second motivation was warmly embraced by Russia and later on by some of the other countries in the region to basically suggest that this is not just a way to make the Chinese currency more prominent in the world, but this is actually a way to deal in local currencies. So many of the projects that we have again seen public documentation on, for example, in Kazakhstan, I mentioned in Russia, in some other parts of Asia, expressly avoid using the dollar as the currency for basically making these transactions. They're either in Chinese currency or combination between Chinese currency and local currency. With time, this motivation seems to be becoming a bigger and bigger part of the rationale, not just of China, but of other countries participating in this initiative to be part of the project. And the third motivation or initiative that I would like to mention on the part of China in developing the One Belt, One Road initiative is essentially to secure its not just energy needs, but generally speaking, its resource needs. So if you look at the projects that have been financed so far, about 80% or so have something to do with either oil and gas or other natural resources that are flowing towards China. So a lot of the projects in Central Asia have this feature. A lot of the projects that are essentially connecting China to Europe have, on the way at least through Russia, have this feature, essentially securing sometimes new sources of resources for China, sometimes old ones, but much closer and much more efficient logistics about getting them to their users. And I think this last motivation is very useful to consider over time, as the price of some of these natural resources has changed tremendously over the last couple of years, certainly since the project started, which may have a large effect on how it develops over time. I should say, in closing on this point, that there are about 20-25% of projects that so far at least have been signed that do not have this feature of being related to natural resources. So there are a number of projects that range from nanotechnology in Russia to real estate development in Sri Lanka to suggest either diversification on the positive side or lack of focus on the not so positive side. Let's hope that it's the former. I would then briefly like to mention some of the challenges that are starting to arise even in this brief 4 or 5 years since the project has been generating some actual infrastructure and other projects. The first challenge that I see is how you actually can evaluate which projects to invest in and which projects not to invest in. And this is from a couple of viewpoints. The one viewpoint is that while this is a fairly large initiative, Fred mentioned that so far it's nearing about $400 billion in terms of investment, actual projects that either are completed or are underway. The ambition is to reach about $4 trillion in terms of investment. At least this is what the documentation that we have seen suggests, which is equivalent to the 2015 foreign currency reserves of China, just to give you some benchmarks. So a fairly large fairly large project. But in terms of financing this, we have counted nearly 40 financial institutions to date that are somehow involved in financing One Belt, One Road initiatives, starting from Bank of China and the national budget of China that, for example, finances a new fund that was recently established called the New Silk Road Fund, to the relatively new Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, to the relatively new so-called BRICS Bank, the new development bank that hasn't yet started investing in projects of the New Silk Road initiative, but intends to the tune of about $12 billion a year. These are the documents that the bank itself has put out, to the China Agricultural Bank, to a number of other financial entities. So in total, about 40 currently have either already financed projects or in the process of developing their own projects. In having so many players on the finance side, the natural question is, well, how do they have a methodology that decides which projects to invest or not? Do these methodologies differ? And more importantly, as I have mentioned, how would these methodologies basically address the issue of rapidly falling, or fallen rather, natural resource prices that we have seen over the last 2 years? And would that imply that a number of the projects that already have been signed but are not yet implemented, a number of them in Central Asia, would that mean that they would go through, or somehow they would be postponed or even cancelled? So that's, I think, to me, the big question mark on challenges. The other one is that, on the one hand, there are a number of countries in this initiative that do welcome additional sources of finance. Some of them, this is the major source of infrastructure finance. In other regions, in my own region of Eastern Europe, many of the countries have the choice of European Union financing versus New Silk Road financing, and there is a competition going on which source of finance to use. And in that competition, the early success stories or failures funded by the New Silk Road initiative are under the microscope. There is one such project mentioned in our study in Poland, which happened to be very politically important for Poland at the time. It was a road part of the European World Cup in soccer championship, and since you know that Europeans are very excited about soccer, they very much needed this road. It was the first large project funded and implemented by a Chinese company in Eastern Europe. And by and large, you'll see the detail in the booklet, it failed. And that project has carried every time that the New Silk Road initiative is mentioned in Europe. The next sentence is, but remember the Polish project and what happened there. So early successes, in other words, are very important to be able to highlight the importance of this project in the future. And I'm sure there are going to be a number of successes. I'll finish just with this final comment on Russia. I mentioned at the beginning that initially Russia viewed this project as a competitor to a number of initiatives, actually. The Russian foreign economic policy is not that coherent either, or perhaps less so than others. So they have a number of projects in the Central Asian region and many of the other countries involved here. So until about mid-2014, this project was viewed as distinctly a competitor project, and hence not to participate in it and not to encourage other countries to participate in it. To the contrary, to discourage some countries. That view changed in late 2014, early 2015, and Russia, I would say, has become one of the most enthusiastic supporters of this project, with a number of specific infrastructure projects already signed, and some of them even on the way to implementation. But in going through this process, Russia has highlighted two issues. One that I mentioned, which is local currencies. Avoid, or maybe not avoid, but use your local currency in the projects that you develop. To what extent this is meaningful or not, perhaps we'll have in the discussion that follows. But the second point, I'll finish with that one, is a relatively new one. Only in the last 2 or 3 months you see this commented by very high level public officials in Russia, which is to say that the new Silk Road project is the counter to the TTIP and the TPP projects that are seen, at least by Russia, as part of the American foreign policy arsenal to essentially unite or bring together Europe and America on the one hand, and Asia and America on the other hand. And what Russia is pointing out is that the success of the One Belt, One Road initiative will bring Europe and Asia together, the Eurasian economic community, if you like, together. And if it's successful, it is a good political and perhaps economic counter to the attempts of the United States to separate, if you like, Asia and Europe. To what extent this is a valid point, either from a trade policy perspective or other foreign policy perspective, I'm not clear yet, but I just wanted to point out that as the project is taking hold and developing, a number of the actors have their own views on how it can be used for their economic development, perhaps, but also for foreign policy. I'll stop here, Fred. Thank you.
Good morning. It's great to be back at the PIE and see so many familiar faces. I'm going to actually make 2 very short presentations. One on the rationale behind the Belt Road Initiative. The other is on the implications of this initiative on China-EU relationship. The paper which was written by a colleague of mine but couldn't join us today. So I prepared some very simple slides to get through the discussion. So why did China and President Xi Jinping make this proposal at this moment, at this time? I'm sure many of you today have your own take, and there are various research papers written as to why China proposed this idea, but I would like to highlight 3 very important areas. I think, well, to begin with, I think the One Belt, One Road initiative is a grand vision. By grand, I mean it's very broad in scope, covers a lot of areas, a lot of sectors, also a lot of countries and regions, but it is also long-term in time. So it may take years and even decades to accomplish the stated objective of the initiative. So we shouldn't jump to conclusions too quickly about the initiative. I believe it has, well, first of all, the initiative will have a very significant implication for China's future and opening up strategy. I think probably everyone in this room agreed that China's economic miracle has largely been built upon our successful implementation of the opening up strategy and to participating in world economic activities and also the global value chain. And China is perhaps the main beneficiary of the last round of globalization. But in the wake of international financial crisis of 2008, I think the world economy has entered a phase of transformation adjustment, and the growth is stagnant across the world, and trade and investment protectionism certainly on the rise. So China urgently needs to formulate and carry out a new round of opening up strategy to fuel domestic growth and upgrade its industrial structure and further improve its economic and trade ties with its partners so as to create a favorable environment for China's peaceful development. I think, first of all, as a result of China's Belt and Road Initiative, China's opening up will be more balanced and sustainable. Because in the past, China's opening up has mainly focused on Macau, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and also advanced economies in Europe and the US, North America. But now we're going to we open up further to developed countries, emerging economies, to our north, to our south, to our west. So the opening up layout be more balanced and sustainable. And secondly, the Belt and Road Initiative will also enhance the degree of openness, hence economic development in border and hinterland areas in China. Because in the past, coastal areas in China have taken lead in development and opening up. Though that is economically reasonable, it produced a very unbalanced regional development in China. So once the Belt and Road Initiative kickstarts, China will shift its focus on inland and border areas, therefore making a more balanced opening up and development situation for China. And actually, the local governments in China are very enthusiastic about the Belt and Road Initiative. Wherever I go to these border areas, the local officials, researchers, business people are all very eager to learn and to act on how to benefit from the Belt and Road Initiative to develop its local economy. This is often neglected by outside observers. And thirdly, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative will further enhance the scope and depth of China's opening up, because we're not only going to concentrate on traditional mechanisms of opening up, such as trading goods, investment, cross-border investment. The initiative will also develop cooperation on trading services, e-commerce, industrial development, infrastructure, connectivity, trade and investment facilitation, information, knowledge sharing, cultural exchanges, and people-to-people communication. It will certainly inject new meaning to China's further opening up and comprehensively enhance China's opening up scope and depth. Secondly, I believe the Belt and Road Initiative will promote regional and world economic growth. Today's world economy situation is very difficult and complicated. It is in serious need of a new engine of growth. I think the Belt and Road Initiative, by allowing different countries to cooperate, open up their markets, and achieve win-win results, can become a new engine for growth for the world economy to embark on a strong, balanced, and sustained growth path. And China enjoys particular advantage due to its adequate foreign exchange reserves and strong production capacity. And China is right now actively engaged with many trade partners by building the so-called 6 economic corridors, which will become a physical barrier of the Belt and Road Initiative. In addition, the upgrading of China-ASEAN free trade zone, the negotiation of a free trade agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council of the Arab State, and also the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and many other regional economic agreements will also be very useful complements to the Belt and Road Initiatives. And many countries, including China, have shifted the focus of cooperation from trade and investment to infrastructure construction, to energy cooperation, to industrial cooperation, financial cooperation, and also promoting tourism and cultural exchange. The China National Tourism Administration has already designed over 200 key projects related to the Belt and Road for the next 3 years to come. And it is estimated by Ernst & Young that in the next 5 years, countries along the Belt and Road Initiative will receive 150 million visits from China with over $200 billion spent. Lastly, I believe the Belt and Road Initiative will make a positive contribution to the orderly development of the global economic governance. We all know the current global governance system is inadequate in addressing the issues we face today, especially the global issues. And China, as the second largest economy in the world, with a high degree of openness and fast growth. It has cast far-reaching influence in many parts of the global economy, including trade, investment, finance, and energy. And after the new leadership of President Xi Jinping came into power in China, China has placed the participation in global governance as an integral and important mechanism for China's opening up strategy. And the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, is an important breakthrough for China to participate in global governance. First of all, the initiative sets an example for establishing international cooperation pattern featuring openness, pragmatism, inclusiveness, and win-win solution. In contrast with some exclusive international governance mechanisms, the Belt and Road is an open system in which all countries can participate. And instead of establishing a mandatory roadmap or timetable, the initiative proceeds from specific projects, allow different countries along the Belt and Road, they can determine the timing, area, and the channel of participation. And secondly, I think the Belt and Road Initiative is an effective platform for global governance, connecting the most dynamic East Asian economies at one end, Eurasia in the middle, and also advanced economies in Western Europe. I think it provides a platform for important emerging market economies to have a dialogue and cooperation with advanced economies and strengthen their communication and cooperation in addressing regional and global issues. And thirdly, I think the Belt and Road Initiative brings new opportunities for cooperation between China and the U.S. As Secretary General Lu mentioned, the U.S. Actually was the first to propose the new Silk Road Initiative, which shares a lot of similarities between the new Silk Road Initiative and also China's Belt and Road Initiative. I do believe the prosperity and stability of Eurasia and also, of course, Asia and Pacific and Europe in general are in the interest of both countries. So I think the two countries can work together. President Xi Jinping, on his visit to the U.S. last year, also welcomed U.S. participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think the two countries can work together to inject new vitality into the economic development of Eurasia and the whole world. So in summary, I think the openness, the features of the One Belt, One Road, which is openness, inclusiveness, cooperation, and win-win, perhaps its main contribution to the order development of the global governance system. Next, I'm going to make a very short presentation on the implication on China-EU relations. This paper is written by Dr. Zhang Minghao of the China Center for Contemporary World Studies at the International Department of CPC. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us today. But actually, he was here a few days ago at the CSIS and Renmin University joint conference on One Belt, One Road. So we know the rationale or motivation of why China launched the Belt and Road Initiative. What about Europe? At the moment, Europe is facing a convergence of worst crisis since World War II, in the words of German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier, spanning from the European sovereign debt crisis, the potential split of the EU, and also refugee crisis, and also the threat of terrorism. And the Belt and Road Initiative is enormously consequential to China and EU relations and Eurasia at large. The initiative would deepen the connection between the East Asian economic circle and develop European economic circle at the other, and it can also tap development potential of countries in the hinterland of Asia and in the New Europe. And EU plays a pivotal role in China's global diplomacy, and EU had been China's biggest trade partner for 12 consecutive years, and there's no geopolitical conflict between China and EU. In recent years, the two sides are seeking to rediscover each other and exploring new paths tailored to their respective objectives and mutual interests. The Belt and Road Initiative are aligned with the existing China-European cooperation agenda, and this initiative can enrich the EU-China comprehensive strategic partnership. First, it will definitely deepen the bilateral economic trade investment ties. They can work together to push ahead with new Eurasian land bridge and other international economic corridors. And also, the two sides can make substantial progress in production capacity and third-party cooperation. And since 2014, the Belt and Road Initiative has become the buzzword during EU-China high-level dialogues and occupies an important position on the policy agenda. First, on the EU level, the two sides decided to integrate the Belt and Road Initiative with the Juncker Plan, establish China-Europe Joint Investment Fund, and China became the first non-EU country to announce its participation to the Juncker Plan. And also, China-Europe blockchains has achieved significant progress, further easing China-Europe trade bottleneck. And thirdly, Central and Eastern European countries play a leading role in the Belt and Road Initiative cooperation. The construction of Hungary-Serbian Railway has started, which is part of the Land Sea Express passage linking China and Europe. China has also put forward a multilateral cooperation plan that involves ports in coastal areas of the Adriatic Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Black Sea, and aims to create a triple win scenario combining China's equipment production with the old Europe advanced technology and New Europe's markets. Fourthly, the United Kingdom, France, and other EU members also provide support of the Belt and Road Initiative. You know, there's heavy participation, has been heavy participation for Western European countries in the formation of AIIB. And also in June 2015, China and France signed a joint statement on cooperation in third-party markets, which is the first such agreement between China and Western countries. And there's also a cooperation of development financing between China and 16 Eastern European countries, Central Eastern European countries. However, there are some challenges. The so-called trust deficits, and also increased economic competition between China and European companies. And also there are obstacles for Chinese companies operating in EU with respect to standards, mechanisms, and laws. I think Simeon mentioned the failure of a Polish project by a Chinese company, I think which is largely because of its unfamiliarity with European regulation and regulatory environment. Of course, there are also political and security risks. But in any case, I think the Belt and Road Initiative presents a great opportunity for China and Europe to deepen its cooperation and promote prosperity and stability in the region. That is the end of my presentation. I welcome your comments. Thank you.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to be here with the Peterson colleagues to discuss One Belt and One Road. You can see in the CDRF material on page 23rd, there is a paper called the Financial Support for OBOR. That's my paper. So for this idea, I think it has been put off for have 2 years because that was first time in 2013. But if it's formally started, I should say it's on last year in March, because Chinese government, they issued a vision and action paper on One Belt, One Road. Then that means it's formally started. And just in last year, I think we have done a lot of work on the One Belt, One Road. And I simply summarize, I think there are 4 works is need to mention here. One is the strong consensus on the One Belt, One Road, because during last year, the Chinese high-ranking leaders, including Xi Jinping, the president, and also the premier Li Keqiang, they visited more than 30 countries, respectively, and all touched on the One Belt, One Road, and they got a lot of consensus on this idea. And China stressed that the cooperation and the integration with the different countries' strategy. So I think that result is very good. The second, we should notice that the infrastructure connection, I think it has been promoted, and I think the progress is very smooth, and they've got a lot of progress. As planned, there are 6 lines for the One Belt, One Road. One is China, Mongolia, and Russia. The second is China, Mid-Asian, and South Europe. And the third is China and Pakistan. And the fourth is China, India, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. And the fifth is the China and Southeast Asia. So there are 6 lines about infrastructure. And also China stressed on the build-up and the construction, infrastructure construction with the neighboring countries. They have done a lot of work. And the third is the trade and investment. And also trade and investment, it includes the industrial cooperation park. That means we set up in different countries along the Silk Road. Now, because this is covered by the Ministry of Commerce, we found from the statistics the business along the Silk Road countries, the trade and investment are growing faster than some other areas, other countries. So it goes very fast. I think the fourth is the financial support. You know, the AIIB is established smoothly, and also we have the Silk Road Fund. They start to work. So I think that means the financial support is already. So from those aspects, we can see the Silk Road, the initiative is on the way. It's doing very good at the beginning. I think it's a good start. But it never means it's easy. I think it's hard work, and it's not so easy. It's at present situation, it's still a lot of changes and challenges, especially from the last year. We know the first challenge is the world economic situation. The world economic situation become more complicated, and also for the developing country it's more difficult. So this turbulence and now not so even recovery we can see from the world, and also the commodity market and the financial market are fluctuated very big. So that's all got the influence on the Silk Road countries. And second, I think it's difficult for the Chinese companies to join and to select the project and also how to get down for some constructions. That's very difficult because most of the requirements, the demand is coming from the Mid-East. But for Mid-East, I think it's not so easy to build roads and railways because the environment there is not very good. It's hard work. And the easy way is in the Southeast Asia because the conditions there is very good. But the situation in Southeast Asia is more complicated. And China, they will do a lot of work to get the bid of the constructions. So maybe you heard Indonesia and Thailand, there are 2 railways. So up to now, they haven't decided finally. They're still under negotiation. And the third is, I think we are facing the financial market. And for the financial corporations, it's very difficult now. Especially the situation is more complicated and the market is not so smooth. It's fluctuated too much. So especially for the Americans, they are increasing their interest rates. So I think there are some influence on the world market. So at that time, if we want to get more financial support from the world market, that we feel very difficult. And the fourth is, it's very difficult for China to get the cooperations with the world financial institutions, and especially difficult for us to issue RMB bond. So that's difficult because that difficult will depends on the Chinese reforms and also the AIIB's work. If they work, they can get some progress with the world organization. Maybe it's good. Last week I heard their news reported that the AIIB signed a contract with the World Bank. They promised to cooperate each other. I think that's a good news because China needs to cooperate with different international financial institutions. Otherwise, it's very difficult. We can't only relying on AIIB, and also the capital is limited. And the fifth is more complicated, is the regional conflicts and the geopolitics. So recent years, we see in Ukraine situation and in Middle East and even in Southeast China, in the Southeast Asian, the situation is not so simple. It's getting more complicated and influence each other. And the countries are trying to stand on each side or to find their stand. But for the futures, I think the Belt and Road is still will getting on further and will develop, have more influence on the world. Because that's, I think, is a good way for the countries along the road to join it. And we find most of the countries along the road are interested in joining this One Belt, One Road. Maybe they all need to, they hope China will invest a lot and they will rely on the financial support. That's true. But on the other hand, we find the ways to cooperate, and as Chinese stressed that the inclusive mutual benefit and how to strengthen the infrastructure, I think it's easy to be accepted by all the countries. So that's I think still a way to push the One Belt, One Road forward. But on the whole, I think it depends. Finally, it will depend on the Chinese economy, the performance of Chinese economy. If China determined to continue to get the reforms and opening to the outside world, especially to get the further reforms for the market-oriented, then China's economy will keep on steady and will get the sustainable growth. That will be the safeguard for the One Belt One Road. And so for China, it's clear we'll make choice of the further reforms and opening up.
Could we go to the panel now? Are you not finished?
Nearly finished.
Okay.
Sorry. So one is for China's development. Second is it will depend on the RMB internationalization. If RMB goes smooth, it will help the One Belt One Road. And third, I think it will depends on the AIIB, the financial institutions. If they go smooth and find more cooperations, that will be good for the Belt and Road. And third, I think the insurance company will better to joining the One Belt One Road. If the insurance join it, it's good for the companies because a lot of Chinese companies invested in One Belt One Road, but in some way there's still some risks. So if the insurance company gets in, it will be good for the companies. So that's all for my papers. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just open with one question and then open it up to the floor. We've only got a few minutes. There were different perspectives on the motivations for the project. Simeon focused, I think, primarily on China's own economic goals, and our two Chinese speakers and Mr. Liu in his opening remarks talked a bit more about contributing to expansion of the economies of the countries involved, contributing to better global governance, and strengthening mutual cooperation. These are not inconsistent, but they are different emphases. So, Simeon, let me ask you to respond to the motivations that were outlined by our Chinese speakers, and maybe I'll ask Mr. Fang Jin to respond to Simeon's focus on China pursuing its own economic goals.
Let's be very quick. It's certainly the case that the success of some of the projects, particularly I would say in some of the smaller countries, would increase in some cases tremendously economic growth in these countries. In the booklet we have a case study from Georgia in the Caucasus where the government has been one of the most enthusiastic in the region in pursuing New Silk Road projects, and there the calculation is that the current two projects that are already under signing with various Chinese financial backers, the two projects alone, one is a railroad project, the other one is a port project, will increase for the next decade or so the GDP of Georgia by about 1.5 percentage points a year on top of what it is. So for a country like Georgia, this is very substantial growth. But for other countries, I think the evidence is still out to what extent these projects are in sync with their own priorities and to what extent they are simply an easier, sometimes cheaper and more secure, most importantly, way to, on the one hand, export natural resources towards China, on the other hand, basically to secure some funding that otherwise would not be available.
Mr. Fang.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to say that China is doing this not because it's unselfish. Certainly, we've made this proposal because it can benefit China's economic development. But we believe the benefits will come from a better global governance system, a better cooperation with our trade investment partners, and a better or improved global economic environment. I agree the three motivations mentioned by Simeon are all legitimate. Either it's trade, RMB internationalization, or secure energy supply. As a matter of fact, in the afternoon panel, two of our colleagues from China will present on the implications of Belt and Road Initiative on RMB internationalization and also energy supply. But it seems to me there are more like secondary benefits or as a result of the things, the areas I mentioned. And also I think RMB internationalization and energy supply, a secure or a more sustainable energy supply are not only good for China, but also for countries engaged in those activities. Thank you.
Okay, floor is open for questions and comments. Just identify yourself. We've got a traveling mic, we've got a standing mic in the back, and identify yourself and try to be succinct. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Vikram Nehru from the Carnegie Endowment, previously from the World Bank, and thanks to all the speakers for their contributions. The first question I have is, it's very good to know about the objective of contributing to global governance of the OBOR initiative, but what about the governance, internal governance of the OBOR initiative? What are the structures in place to actually coordinate the OBOR initiative within the Chinese government? I understand there's a leading group which has been put in place in the NDRC, but how is this group structured? What are its powers? How does it coordinate the 40 financial institutions which Simeon mentioned? So how is this all organized within China? Secondly, nobody's mentioned the very interesting development that the Belt and Road Initiative has had in crowding in additional finance. So Japan is now has announced a new initiative to contribute $110 billion through JBIC for Asian infrastructure. So that's an interesting development. And similarly, we've had the AIIB lead to reactions from the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. So that's also a very positive contribution. So I'd like to hear your views on that. Thank you.
Let's take these first 4 questions together and then come back. No, go ahead. You go ahead.
All right. Susan Lawrence with the Congressional Research Service. I have a quite specific question for our Chinese colleagues. At the National People's Congress in March, the premier and the head of the NDRC, Xu Shaoshi, both spoke at some length about Belt and Road, but also about a separate initiative, this international cooperation on industrial capacity. And they seem to be sort of similar and overlapping, and I'm wondering if you can explain the relationship between them. So, as I understand it, the industrial capacity project, the idea is to be exporting industrial capacity to other countries. Sometimes these are this is industrial production lines that maybe are not needed in China anymore, to export them to other countries so that China can upgrade internally. And the other goal, as I understand it, is to take some leading cutting-edge Chinese technologies and make them go global by having demonstration projects like the high-speed rail line in Indonesia, which is also a Belt and Road project, or like the railways in Thailand and one other country there, anyway, which are also Belt and Road projects. So what is the relationship between these two clearly very big projects that the government is very committed to? How do they relate?
Okay, Nick, why don't you go ahead? And then, lady in the back, why don't you go to that mic in the back?
Yeah, Nick Lardy, Peterson. I want to question. My question's very simple, but probably hard to answer, and that is, when some of the papers have quite a bit of information about how much money is being allocated or invested in various projects, and I was particularly interested in the accounting that China Development Bank had by October last year, had financed 400 projects, financing about $100 billion US. So this kind of approach seems to take any loan that's going to one of these 65 countries and counting it in the One Belt, One Road system. But my real question is, what's the additionality? A lot of this stuff was started before One Belt, One Road was announced. Some of it would have been done anyway. So what's the order of magnitude? What can we say about how much of this was ongoing anyway and how much of it is really additional above and beyond what would have been done?
Okay, go ahead. Fourth question in the back, then we'll come to the panelists.
Hi, Denise Carpenter with the U.S. Department of Commerce. Simeon mentioned that 3/4 of the projects under the One Belt, One Road are the contracts are tied to Chinese companies and know-how and products. And I'm just wondering how there's been a lot of emphasis on how we're going to the economies are going to be, it's going to be mutually beneficial. I'm wondering how you reconcile if all of this business is only going to Chinese companies, what is the benefits to the local economies where these projects are happening? What is their participation if contracts are tied to Chinese companies? And also, how do you find out about those projects if they're not all tied to just Chinese exports and contracts? How do other countries and companies find out about those projects if they're interested in bidding?
Okay, a lot of those questions I think are for our Chinese friends. Mr. Fang, would you like to?
Maybe Mr. Hall?
Mr. Wo, sure.
I'll talk the government function. That's a good question because in China we often discuss on this topic how the government roles in this One Belt, One Road, because the initiative is put off by the government. So all the different provinces and all the companies are joining it. So we often say the government won't dominate all the One Belt, One Road constructions. The government should build up the platform for the companies to join it. That's important. And also, when the company joins it, it should be market-oriented. It can't rely on the government. So some principles, I think, now is getting clear. So in China, from National Development and Reform Committee and also Ministry of Commerce and also Foreign Affairs Ministry, these three ministries are working together. They have a coordination group. That's only for coordination, not for the specific work. Because you see, China now, they have many railways shipped to different countries, especially to Europe. So because too many railways, so they need to coordinate and not for one province, for one railway. So that's too much. So they are trying to solve the problem. So I think in future, that's market will decide it. Because for the companies, when they invest in the Belt and Road countries, they will responsible for their own losses. So the sustainable development will depend on the company's losses or not. If they don't have losses, they will continue to invest. If they have losses, then things won't be easy for them to continue to do it. So that's it. I don't know whether I got it clear.
Simeon, you want to come in?
Quickly on.
Oh, sorry. Oh, please, you first.
I'll switch to the last two questions. So if you still have on the first
capacity.
questions.
Yeah, we have to wrap up because we're about to our lunch hour, but go ahead and try to answer as succinctly as you can.
So on the last two questions, first Nick's question. From 2015, there was official statistical announcement that 41% of all China-funded projects, so projects funded by Chinese financial institutions, belong to the One Belt, One Road. So this is the official statement. How much of this would have happened otherwise? I think as economists, I would go at two levels. So first, I mentioned that while a lot of the projects are infrastructure, there is about 20-25% that are not infrastructure. These projects, from what I've seen them in Eastern Europe, in Russia, the latest one is the 4 billion euro for the Juncker initiative. I would count as they would have happened anyhow, so they're not related to the substance of this project. It's just a convenient title for them. So at least 25%, in other words, I would immediately say would have happened anyhow. Of the remainder, let's say 3/4 that are mostly infrastructure projects, how much would have happened without this project? I would say the majority would have happened without this project, because many of the projects that are now, let's say, graduating actually started before the initiative itself, and that then later were, let's say, subsumed by this initiative. But the big confusion is that so many actors on the financing side participate that they report, I think, the same project for different purposes, as actually the World Bank does and some other international institution. And lastly, on the last question on contracting, I was in the Bulgarian government, as was mentioned, when the initiative started. And we had a real issue. We had some very good projects suggested, but public procurement in Bulgaria does not allow you to, you have to go through the process for any project, so you cannot say who would be contracted at the end. So that's one reason that Bulgaria still doesn't have a single project. It conflicts with the public procurement rules in Bulgaria. The conflicting evidence, as I mentioned, that the one study that exists says that over 70% of the available projects, it's not exclusively to, I should say, Chinese contractors, but Chinese contractors do participate in 70% of the projects. How to make that over time be first transparent, which it is not yet in most cases, or at least in some cases, and mutually beneficial. I think the more evidence we have as this project develops, the more pressure it would have, including for the countries themselves. That's why I mentioned the case of Bulgaria, for it to be opened for whoever the best contractors are. And I think then the project really would take off. The reason that it's not taking off, at least in parts of Eastern Europe that I know, is that it conflicts with the prevailing public procurement rules.
Mr. Fang, a final word?
I'll add something on the capacity cooperation, the industry capacity cooperation. I think that is a broad idea, a broad concept. It's not only means for the steels and the cements and the glasses. It also have some high-end industries, such as nuclear industry, and also the high-speed railways, and not only the cooperation with the Belt and Road countries, also with the European, even American, some developed countries. So you know we have a nuclear cooperation with in UK. I think that shows also fall in the capacity cooperation. But for some of the One Belt One Road countries, maybe they need some steels or some cements. If they need, we can help to build something. I know in Malaysia, we built a steel industry only for 30 million tons. It's worked very good, and it's have got the efficiency. And also, along the Chinese neighboring countries, they are badly needed the electricity. So China maybe to cooperate with them to build some hydropowers. So that depends on their need. If they need, they welcome the investment, we can do it. I think so.
Okay, let me try to answer the
Okay.
questions that hasn't been touched. First of all, I think, like Ms. Nehru said, AIB actually provoked a very positive and contribution from other development institutions in other countries. And I think that is the idea. That is why I said the Belt and Road Initiative sets a good example for improving the global governance system by providing this idea that cooperation and win-win, open and flexible mechanism to help promote economic development. And also, I think the Belt and Road Initiative is, like I said, it's a grand vision, requires participation from all the countries involved. Also, different actors should also, it's open to not only Chinese companies to answer the last question, but also to local companies and even companies from other countries like the US. They can certainly participate and benefit from this initiative. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks to the three speakers. Got us off to an extremely good start. We will now break for lunch. The luncheon is served at the buffet table in the back. Please go back, serve yourself, return to your table quickly so that we can then resume the program with the next part. Please join me in thanking our three initial speakers. Good job.